January 17, 1945, Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. The winter rain fell in sheets across the cliffs of Kuramaredo, a small archipelago west of Okinawa's main island. The sound was relentless, a drumming against stone and mud that swallowed every other noise. In a cave carved into volcanic rock, 23 Japanese women huddled together in the darkness. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Outside, the voices of American soldiers grew louder, closer, accompanied by the metallic clink of rifles and the squelch of boots in saturated earth. The women pressed themselves against the cave's rear wall, their fingers interlocked, their eyes wide with terror. They had been told what would happen if the Americans found them. They had been told many things. For months, the Imperial Japanese government had distributed pamphlets and broadcast radio messages across the home islands, preparing civilians for the inevitable American invasion. These materials painted a portrait of the enemy so monstrous, so devoid of humanity, that death, self-inflicted death, seemed not only preferable but noble. The women in that cave had memorized these warnings. American soldiers, they were told, were barbaric demons who would torture, rape, and murder every Japanese woman and child they encountered. Surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Surrender meant becoming playthings for savages, objects to be violated and discarded. The imperial military had even distributed grenades to civilian families with explicit instructions. If capture seemed imminent, parents were to kill their children first, then themselves. This was not presented as tragedy, but as duty, a final act of loyalty to the emperor and the preservation of Japanese purity. The cave women clutched fragments of this ideology in their trembling hands. Some held small knives. Others gripped rocks with edges sharp enough to open veins. One woman, barely 17 years old, whispered the phrase her mother had taught her before fleeing their village: "Death before dishonor, death before the Americans." The others murmured agreement, a collective prayer to steel themselves for what they believed must come next. Outside, a voice called out in broken Japanese, "Come out, safe, no hurt." The words were clumsy, mangled by an unfamiliar tongue, but the meaning was clear. The women did not move. They had been warned about this too. The Americans would lie, would coax them out with false promises before the horror began. But then something unexpected happened. A small object rolled into the cave's entrance, catching the dim light. It was a tin can. The women stared at it, their bodies rigid with fear. Was it a grenade? A weapon designed to flush them out or kill them where they cowered? For several seconds, no one dared breathe. Then slowly, one of the older women, a schoolteacher named Fumiko, crawled forward. Her hands shook as she reached for the can, expecting it to explode. Instead, her fingers closed around cold metal, embossed with English letters she could not read. She pulled it back into the darkness and examined it by the faint glow of a dying candle stub. It was not a weapon. It was food. The can contained pineapple slices, suspended in sweet syrup. Fumiko had never seen pineapple before, had never tasted anything like the golden fruit that gleamed inside that tin. She looked at the other women, confusion replacing terror on her face. More cans followed: peaches, condensed milk, crackers wrapped in wax paper. Then came canteens of clean water, blankets still warm from American packs, and finally, a photograph. An American soldier smiling beside a woman and two small children, all of them laughing in front of a white house with a manicured lawn. The soldier outside the cave had thrown in a picture of his own family. This was not what they had been told to expect. This was not the behavior of demons. To understand the profound psychological shock experienced by Japanese female prisoners of war in 1945, one must first understand the machinery of indoctrination that shaped their expectations. The Japanese home islands had become a fortress of propaganda by the final years of World War II. As American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, capturing territory inch by bloody inch, the imperial government intensified its campaign to prepare civilians for total war. This preparation was not merely logistical, it was ideological, psychological, and deeply spiritual. The Japanese people were taught that surrender was not simply defeat, but a betrayal of everything sacred: the emperor, the nation, their ancestors, and their own humanity. The propaganda took many forms. In schools, children as young as 6 were drilled in the concept of gyokuse, honorable death rather than capture. Textbooks illustrated this principle with historical examples: samurai who committed seppuku rather than face dishonor, soldiers who charged enemy positions with grenades strapped to their chests, entire families who leapt from cliffs on Saipan rather than fall into American hands. These were not presented as tragedies but as moral exemplars. Teachers explained that the American enemy was subhuman, a collection of mongrel races without culture, discipline, or honor. Americans, the children learned, were motivated solely by greed and lust. They would steal Japan's resources, defile its women, and erase its culture. For women and girls, the messaging was particularly dark. Pamphlets distributed by the military depicted American soldiers as rapists and murderers, illustrated with crude drawings of women being violated and children bayoneted. Radio broadcasts featured testimonies, many of them fabricated or coerced, from alleged survivors of American attacks in other Pacific territories. These women described atrocities in graphic detail, their voices breaking with rehearsed anguish. The message was unambiguous: American captivity meant sexual slavery, torture, and death. Better to die on Japanese soil with dignity intact than to endure such degradation. This propaganda was reinforced by Japan's military culture, which had long equated surrender with the ultimate shame. Japanese soldiers were expected to fight to the death, and those who allowed themselves to be captured were considered traitors who had forfeited their humanity. This attitude extended to civilians as well. On islands like Saipan and Tinian, thousands of Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than surrender to American forces. Families held hands and jumped from cliffs. Mothers drowned their children in the surf before drowning themselves. Fathers detonated grenades in caves packed with their loved ones. American soldiers, many of them still teenagers themselves, watched in horror as Japanese civilians chose death over the mere possibility of capture. The Americans tried to stop them, shouting reassurances, waving white flags, even risking their own lives to pull people back from cliff edges. But the fear was too deeply ingrained. By early 1945, as American forces prepared to invade Okinawa, the imperial government knew that the war was lost. But rather than sue for peace, Japan's leaders chose to fight on, hoping that by inflicting massive casualties on the Americans, they could negotiate a conditional surrender that would preserve the emperor and the essence of the Japanese state. Okinawa would be the testing ground for this strategy. The island's civilian population, over 300,000 people, would be conscripted into the defense. Women and children were trained to fight with sharpened bamboo spears. The elderly were organized into labor battalions to build fortifications, and everyone was given the same instruction: do not surrender, die for the emperor, die for Japan. The women in the Kurama cave were products of this system. They had been taught from childhood that the Americans were monsters. They had listened to the radio broadcasts, read the pamphlets, attended the school assemblies where military officers explained what would happen if Japan lost the war. Some of them had family members in the military, brothers, fathers, husbands, who had reinforced these beliefs in letters from the front. Others had been recruited into auxiliary units, given rudimentary training in battlefield first aid or communications, and told they might be called upon to fight if the Americans landed. None of them had ever met an American. Their entire understanding of the enemy was based on abstractions, caricatures, and lies. So when the American soldiers arrived at their cave on that rain-soaked January day, the women expected brutality. They expected violence. They expected everything they had been promised. Instead, they received canned pineapple. The disconnect between expectation and reality struck the women like a physical blow. Fumiko, the schoolteacher, sat in the dim cave turning the can of pineapple over in her hands, trying to reconcile what she held with what she had been taught. The other women watched her, their faces registering confusion, suspicion, and the first fragile stirrings of hope. One of them, a girl named Yashiko who worked in a textile factory before the war, whispered, "Maybe it's poisoned." The suggestion hung in the air. It made sense within the framework they had been given. The Americans were cruel and deceitful. Of course, they would poison food to kill Japanese civilians without firing a shot. But Fumiko, who had spent her adult life teaching logic and literature to middle school students, found herself questioning the narrative for the first time. If the Americans wanted to kill them, why go to such elaborate lengths? They had guns. They had grenades. They could simply toss explosives into the cave and move on. Why offer food at all? Why throw in a photograph of a family? What kind of demon showed you pictures of his children? She said none of this aloud. The fear of being labeled a traitor, even among these desperate women, was too strong. But she thought it, and thinking it changed something fundamental in her understanding of the war. Outside the cave, the American soldiers waited. They were members of the 77th Infantry Division, veterans of brutal fighting in Guam and Leyte, men who had seen friends blown apart by artillery and comrades die screaming in mud. They were exhausted, traumatized, and far from home. But they were also products of a different culture, one that had taught them different lessons about war and humanity. Most of these soldiers had grown up during the Great Depression, had known hunger and hardship, had watched their parents struggle to keep families fed. They understood suffering not as an abstraction but as lived experience. And despite the horrors they had witnessed in the Pacific, Japanese soldiers feigning surrender to detonate grenades, banzai charges that left beaches carpeted with bodies, the discovery of atrocities committed against Allied prisoners, most of them still clung to a belief that civilians were not the enemy. The soldier who had thrown the cans into the cave was a corporal from Iowa named Thomas Mitchell. Before the war, he had worked on his family's farm, a modest operation that grew corn and raised hogs. He was 23 years old, married, and the father of a 1-year-old daughter he had never met. The photograph he threw into the cave was his only copy, carried in his breast pocket through 2 years of combat. He did not speak Japanese, had no training in psychological operations or cultural sensitivity. He simply knew that there were women hiding in that cave, and women reminded him of his wife, his mother, his sister. So he gave them what he had, food from his rations and proof that he, too, was human. His commanding officer, Lieutenant James Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, had ordered his men to approach all civilian encounters with caution and compassion. Chen had seen what happened on Saipan, had watched Japanese civilians hurl themselves to their deaths because they believed American soldiers were subhuman monsters. He was determined not to let that happen again. So he instructed his men to move slowly, to speak gently, to offer food and water before making any demands. "They've been lied to," he told his platoon during a briefing the night before they landed on Kuramaredo. "Their government has told them we're devils. We have to show them that's not true. We have to be better than what they've been told." This philosophy was not unique to Chen's platoon. Across the Pacific Theater, American commanders grappled with the challenge of convincing Japanese civilians to surrender. The U.S. military printed millions of leaflets in Japanese, promising safety and fair treatment to those who gave up. Aircraft dropped these leaflets over Japanese positions, hopping to reach soldiers and civilians alike. Some leaflets included photographs of Japanese prisoners of war being treated well, eating hot meals, receiving medical care, writing letters to their families. Others featured testimonials from captured soldiers who described their surprise at American kindness. But these efforts had limited success. The Japanese people had been so thoroughly conditioned to distrust the Americans that many believed the leaflets were forgeries, the photographs staged propaganda. The women in the cave faced a similar crisis of belief. The evidence before them, canned fruit, clean water, warm blankets, a family photograph, contradicted everything they knew, or thought they knew. Fumiko made a decision. She opened the can of pineapple using the edge of a rock and tasted the syrup. It was sweet, almost unbearably so, a burst of flavor unlike anything she had eaten in years. Japan's food situation had deteriorated catastrophically by 1945. Rationing had reduced most civilians to subsistence diets of rice, sweet potatoes, and whatever could be foraged. Sugar was a distant memory. Fruit was a luxury reserved for the military and party elites. The pineapple in Fumiko's mouth was more than food. It was proof of abundance, of a world beyond scarcity and sacrifice. She passed the can to the next woman, who hesitated before taking a small sip of the syrup. Then another woman took it, and another, until all 23 had tasted the pineapple. No one died. No one convulsed or foamed at the mouth. The food was real and it was safe. Yashiko, the factory girl, began to cry. The sound was soft at first, then grew louder until she was sobbing openly, her body shaking with the release of terror and confusion. One by one, the other women joined her, their collective grief filling the cave. They cried for the fear they had carried, for the lies they had believed, for the world they thought they knew that was dissolving like sugar in water. Fumiko crawled to the cave entrance and looked out. The American soldiers stood in the rain, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their postures relaxed. One of them noticed her and raised a hand in a slow, non-threatening wave. He said something she did not understand, but his tone was gentle, almost apologetic. Fumiko thought about the grenade she had been given by a Japanese soldier 3 days earlier, told to use it if the Americans came. She thought about the instructions to kill herself and the other women rather than allow them to be captured. She thought about the emperor's voice on the radio, the pamphlets, the teachers who had prepared her for this moment. And she thought about the pineapple. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling. The other women watched in silence. Fumiko stepped out of the cave into the rain, raising her hands above her head. The American soldiers did not shoot. They did not rush forward. They simply waited, letting her come to them at her own pace. When she was close enough to see their faces clearly, she saw that they were young. Some of them looked barely older than her students. They were dirty, tired, and wet. They looked like boys pretending to be soldiers. One of them offered her a blanket, draping it over her shoulders before stepping back to give her space. Another held out a canteen. Fumiko took it and drank, the clean water washing away the taste of fear. Behind her, the other women began to emerge from the cave. The capture of Japanese female prisoners of war was not a common occurrence in the Pacific theater. Unlike European conflicts, where surrender was relatively routine and prisoner exchanges followed established protocols, the war in the Pacific was characterized by a near-total absence of Japanese military surrenders until the final months. The numbers tell a stark story. During the Battle of Saipan in the summer of 1944, American forces took fewer than 1,000 Japanese military prisoners out of a garrison of over 30,000. The rest died fighting or committed suicide. Similar patterns emerged on Iwo Jima, where only 216 of the 21,000 Japanese defenders were captured alive. The Japanese military culture of Bushido, combined with propaganda warning of American atrocities, created a situation where death was preferable to the shame of surrender. Civilians occupied an ambiguous space in this ideology. They were not technically combatants, but in the total war environment of 1945, the line between soldier and civilian had blurred almost to invisibility. The Japanese government had mobilized the entire population for the war effort. Women worked in munitions factories, producing bullets and bombs. Children collected scrap metal and grew victory gardens. The elderly served as air raid wardens and fire brigades. On Okinawa, the military distributed weapons to civilians and organized them into combat units. Teenage boys were formed into Blood and Iron Corps, given rudimentary training, and sent to attack American tanks with satchel charges. Girls as young as 15 were recruited into nursing units and deployed to the front lines. The women captured at Karamaredo occupied this gray zone. They were not soldiers, but they were not entirely civilians either. Several had been members of women's auxiliary units, trained in basic first aid and communications. Others had worked in support roles for the military, cooking, cleaning, repairing uniforms. A few had been nurses, tending to wounded soldiers in field hospitals. Under international law, they should have been treated as non-combatants, but the chaos of the Pacific War made such distinctions difficult to maintain. More importantly, the women themselves did not understand these legal categories. They knew only that they had been serving the Japanese military effort, and that this service made them targets for American retribution. The American treatment of these women shocked them precisely because it violated every expectation the Japanese propaganda machine had created. Rather than being raped, tortured, or executed, the women from Karamaredo were taken to a processing center where they were given medical examinations, clean clothes, and hot food. The medical exams were conducted by female personnel whenever possible. The U.S. military had recruited Japanese-American nurses and translators specifically for this purpose. The women were asked about their health, treated for malnutrition and minor injuries, and given vaccinations against typhoid and other diseases that had ravaged the Japanese home islands as sanitation systems collapsed. One of the nurses, a Nisei woman named Grace Takahashi from Los Angeles, spent hours talking with the captured women, explaining what would happen to them and trying to ease their fears. Grace spoke fluent Japanese, having grown up in a bilingual household, and her presence was profoundly reassuring to women who had been taught that all Americans were white barbarians. Here was a woman who looked like them, spoke their language, and worked for the American military, a living contradiction to everything they had been told. Grace later recorded her experiences in a series of letters to her family, describing the disbelief and gradual transformation she witnessed. They expect us to hurt them. You can see it in their eyes, the way they flinch when we approach, even when we're holding medicine or food. One woman, maybe 40 years old, told me through tears that she had 3 daughters at home and was glad they weren't here to suffer what she believed would happen. When I explained that nothing bad would happen, that she would be kept safe and eventually reunited with her family, she looked at me like I was lying. It took days before she believed me. Days of showing her, over and over, that we meant what we said. The food became a symbol of this transformation. Every meal served to the Japanese POWs was an education in American abundance and a refutation of Japanese propaganda. The women from Karamaredo, who had subsisted on watery rice gruel and pickled vegetables for months, were suddenly presented with meals that included meat, fresh vegetables, bread with butter, coffee, and canned fruit. The quantities were staggering by Japanese standards. Portion sizes that would have fed an entire family back home were given to individual prisoners. Some of the women couldn't finish their meals and tried to save food for later, terrified that this abundance was temporary, a cruel trick that would end any moment. But the food kept coming. 3 meals a day, every day, with snacks available between meals. The women gained weight, their hollowed cheeks filling out, their bodies recovering from years of deprivation. Yashiko, the factory girl, wrote in a diary she was given by an American Red Cross worker, "I have eaten more in the past week than in the previous 6 months. There is chocolate, real chocolate. I had forgotten such things existed. The Americans have so much food they give it away, throw it away even." I watched a soldier discard half a sandwich because he was full. Half a sandwich. In Japan, we would have divided that between 4 people and felt blessed. What kind of country has so much that it can waste food? What kind of country sends such plenty to the far edge of the world to feed its enemies? This question haunted many of the Japanese POWs. The material reality of American military logistics was a propaganda weapon more powerful than any leaflet. The United States had built a supply chain capable of delivering fresh food, clean water, medical supplies, and even luxury items to soldiers fighting on remote Pacific islands thousands of miles from the American mainland. Japanese troops, by contrast, were starving. The imperial military had failed to adequately supply its own forces, let alone the civilian population. Soldiers on bypassed islands resorted to cannibalism. Civilians on the home islands were reduced to eating grass and tree bark. The contrast was so stark that some captured Japanese soldiers initially believed American supply depots were elaborate stage sets designed to demoralize prisoners. The women from Karama Redo gradually came to understand that the abundance was real, and with that understanding came a profound cognitive dissonance. If America had so much, why had Japan told them the Americans were desperate and weak? If American soldiers were capable of such kindness, why had Japan described them as monsters? The questions multiplied, each one chipping away at the edifice of lies that had sustained Japanese morale throughout the war. The psychological transformation experienced by Japanese female POWs unfolded in stages, documented in American military reports, Red Cross records, and personal accounts from both prisoners and their captors. The initial stage was pure terror, the expectation of imminent violence. This gave way to confusion when the violence did not materialize, followed by suspicion that the kindness was temporary or conditional. Only after days or weeks of consistent humane treatment did the women begin to accept that their captivity would not involve the horrors they had been promised. Lieutenant Chen's platoon, which had been among the first to encounter civilian refugees on Karama Redo, maintained detailed records of their interactions. Chen, who would later become a career military officer and rise to the rank of colonel, wrote in his after-action report, "The Japanese civilians are traumatized not only by the war, but by their own government's propaganda. They have been systematically terrorized into believing that capture by American forces is worse than death. Our primary mission in these early encounters is not military but humanitarian. We must demonstrate through our actions that they have been lied to. Every act of kindness, every meal shared, every instance of medical care provided is a blow against the Japanese propaganda machine." This approach was not motivated purely by altruism. American commanders understood that humane treatment of prisoners had strategic value. Japanese soldiers who witnessed civilians being treated well were more likely to surrender themselves. Prisoners who were well fed and cared for could be employed in labor battalions, reducing the burden on American forces. And on a more abstract level, treating prisoners humanely aligned with American values and projected soft power, showing the world that the United States fought not out of racial hatred, but for legitimate strategic objectives. But for the individual soldiers interacting with Japanese POWs, the motivations were often simpler and more personal. Corporal Mitchell, who had given away his family photograph, told a Stars and Stripes reporter weeks later, "They're just people, scared people who have been fed a bunch of lies. I thought about my wife and my little girl back home, and I figured if I was killed and the Japanese invaded Iowa, I'd want someone to treat my family decent. That's all I was doing, treating people decent." This sentiment was echoed by many American servicemen, though not all. The Pacific War had been characterized by extreme brutality on both sides, and many American soldiers harbored deep hatred for the Japanese after witnessing atrocities or losing friends to suicidal Banzai charges. Some refused to take prisoners at all. Others treated captured Japanese with contempt or violence. But official policy, reinforced by commanders like Lieutenant Chen, increasingly emphasized the strategic and moral importance of humane treatment. For the women themselves, the transformation was both psychological and physical. Medical records show that most of the women captured in early 1945 were severely malnourished, suffering from vitamin deficiencies, parasitic infections, and untreated injuries. The combination of adequate food, clean water, and medical care produced rapid improvements in their health, but the psychological recovery was more complex. Fumiko, the schoolteacher, became an informal leader among the POWs, using her education and communication skills to help the other women navigate their new reality. She spent hours in conversation with Grace Takahashi, the Nisei nurse, asking questions about America, about the war, about why everything they had been told turned out to be false. Grace answered patiently, explaining the American perspective on the war, the values of democracy and individual freedom, the history of Japanese aggression in Asia. Some of this information was propaganda in its own right. American officials were not shy about presenting their country in the most favorable light possible, but much of it was simply true. Fumiko began keeping a journal, writing in careful characters on paper provided by the Red Cross. Her entries chronicle a gradual awakening. March 3, 1945. We have been here 3 weeks. The food is still plentiful. No one has been harmed. I am beginning to wonder if everything we were taught was a lie. March 10, 1945. Nurse Takahashi told me about the Japanese Army's actions in China. The Nanking Massacre. I did not believe her at first, but she showed me photographs from American newspapers, testimonies from witnesses. If these things are true, and I think they must be, then perhaps we were not the victims but the aggressors. The thought makes me sick. March 17, 1945. I watched American soldiers play baseball today. They invited some of the POWs to join them. One of our girls, Keiko, actually played. She hit the ball and ran to first base while the soldiers cheered. This is what our government called a demon race. These young men who play games and share their food, we have been fools. March 25, 1945. I asked Nurse Takahashi why the Americans treat us so well when we are their enemies. She said, "Because you're not our enemies. Your government is. You're just people who got caught in the middle." I think about this constantly. If she is right, then everything, the emperor, the divine mission, the sacred war, all of it is a lie built on lies. This intellectual and emotional journey was not unique to Fumiko. Across the POW camps established on Okinawa and other captured territories, Japanese prisoners grappled with the dissonance between propaganda and reality. Some clung to their indoctrinated beliefs, insisting that American kindness was temporary, or that the POWs who embraced it were traitors. Others, like Fumiko, underwent profound ideological transformations, questioning not just the war but the entire structure of Japanese imperial ideology. The symbolic power of food in this transformation cannot be overstated. Every meal was a reminder that America possessed resources beyond Japanese imagination. The canned pineapple that Fumiko first tasted in the cave became, in her mind, a metaphor for American abundance, preserved sweetness that could travel halfway around the world and still taste fresh. She wrote about it obsessively in her journal, describing the texture, the flavor, the way the syrup caught the light. The pineapple represented everything Japan lacked: surplus, generosity, the ability to care for people beyond the immediate circle of family or nation. Other women fixated on different symbols. For Yashiko, it was chocolate, rich, sweet, and utterly alien to her wartime experience. She hoarded chocolate bars given to her by American soldiers, not to eat but to look at, to hold, to prove to herself that such luxury existed. For another woman, Michiko, who had been a farmer's wife before the war, it was white bread. She had never seen bread so white, so soft, so far removed from the coarse barley and millet cakes that constituted bread in rural Japan. The whiteness seemed impossible, almost supernatural, as if American bakers had discovered a way to refine wheat beyond what nature intended. These fixations were not trivial or materialistic. They represented the collision of two worlds, one defined by scarcity, sacrifice, and collective suffering, the other by abundance, individualism, and the possibility of comfort. The women were not simply being fed, they were being shown an alternative vision of what society could provide for its members, and that vision was profoundly destabilizing to their understanding of Japan's place in the world. As the war ground toward its conclusion in the summer of 1945, the number of Japanese POWs in American custody increased dramatically. The invasion of Okinawa, which began in April and continued through June, resulted in the capture of over 10,000 Japanese military personnel and an estimated 100,000 civilians who were processed through American-controlled refugee camps. Many of these civilians were women, children, and elderly people who had survived the most brutal land battle of the Pacific War. They emerged from caves, tunnels, and destroyed villages carrying whatever possessions they had managed to preserve: photographs, family registers, Buddhist prayer beads, fragments of a life that had been blown apart. The American military's approach to these refugees evolved rapidly as commanders gained experience managing large civilian populations. The initial focus on humanitarian aid, providing food, water, and medical care, expanded to include education, employment, and even entertainment. POW camps established schools where Japanese children could continue their education, though with curricula stripped of militaristic propaganda. Women were employed in laundries, kitchens, and administrative roles, receiving payment in scrip that could be used to purchase additional food or supplies. Movie nights were organized, showing American films dubbed or subtitled in Japanese, offering glimpses of American life that contradicted years of propaganda. One such film screening became a pivotal moment for many POWs. The movie was Meet Me in St. Louis, a 1944 musical starring Judy Garland. To American audiences, it was light entertainment, a nostalgic look at turn-of-the-century American family life. But to Japanese POWs who had been taught that Americans were cultureless barbarians, the film was a revelation. Here were Americans singing, dancing, celebrating family bonds and community traditions. The houses were large and comfortable. The characters worried about trivial things, dances, parties, whether they would have to move to New York. No one was starving. No one was dying for the emperor. The contrast with Japanese wartime cinema, which glorified sacrifice and martial virtue, was striking. Fumiko attended a screening of this film in May 1945. She sat in a makeshift theater, a cleared warehouse with benches and a projector, surrounded by dozens of other Japanese women. As the film played, she watched her companions' faces, seeing confusion, wonder, and something approaching grief. During a scene where the Garland character sings, "Have yourself a merry little Christmas," several women began to cry. The song was about missing someone, about hoping for their return, about the simple wish for family reunion. These were emotions the Japanese women understood intimately, but they had never heard them expressed so directly, so sentimentally, in a film. Japanese cinema of the war years had no room for such vulnerability. Sadness was acceptable only if it motivated sacrifice. Longing was weakness unless directed toward the emperor or the nation. After the screening, Fumiko spoke with Grace Takahashi about the experience. "Is America really like that?" she asked. "Do people really live in houses that large? Do they really have time to worry about parties and dances?" Grace considered the question carefully. "For some people, yes," she said. "Not everyone. America has poor people too, people who struggle. But yes, many Americans live comfortable lives. They have enough to eat. They have time for music and entertainment. That's what we're fighting for, the right to live our lives without constant fear or sacrifice." Fumiko absorbed this, adding it to her growing catalog of challenges to Japanese ideology. The concept that a nation could prioritize individual comfort over collective glory was alien to everything she had learned. In Japan, the individual existed to serve the state. Personal desires were selfish unless they aligned with national goals. The idea that American soldiers were fighting to preserve their ability to go to dances and sing songs seemed absurd, but also deeply human in a way that Japanese militarism had never acknowledged. This tension, between the collective and the individual, between sacrifice and comfort, between national glory and personal happiness, became a central theme in the POW's evolving understanding of the war. Many of the women had lost husbands, brothers, or sons to the fighting. They had been taught that these deaths were noble, necessary, part of Japan's divine mission. But as they experienced American abundance and kindness, they began to question whether any mission justified such suffering. If American soldiers could be gentle with their enemies while still fighting effectively, did that mean the cruelty of Japanese military culture was unnecessary? If America could feed its troops so well that they had leftovers to share with POWs, what did that say about Japan's claims of resource scarcity justifying extreme measures? These questions did not have easy answers, and many women struggled with guilt as they entertained such thoughts. Questioning the war effort felt like betraying the men who had died for it. Accepting American kindness felt like dishonoring Japanese sacrifice. But the cognitive dissonance was too powerful to ignore. The evidence of their own experiences contradicted the propaganda too thoroughly. By June 1945, as the Battle of Okinawa concluded with catastrophic losses on all sides, the POW population included women who had witnessed some of the war's worst horrors. They had seen Japanese soldiers force civilians to commit suicide rather than surrender. They had watched kamikaze pilots, some of them barely old enough to shave, drink ceremonial sake before climbing into planes loaded with explosives. They had hidden in caves while American artillery pulverized the island, then emerged to find landscapes transformed into moonscapes of craters and corpses. And through it all, they had been told that the Americans were the monsters, the aggressors, the force of evil that must be resisted at all costs. The contrast between this propaganda and the reality of American POW camps created a psychological crisis that military psychiatrists and Red Cross workers struggled to address. Some women experienced what would now be recognized as severe cognitive dissonance, becoming withdrawn or depressed as their worldview collapsed. Others embraced their new understanding with almost evangelical fervor, becoming vocal critics of Japanese militarism and enthusiastic students of American culture. Most fell somewhere in between, carrying the weight of contradictory truths and trying to reconcile what they had believed with what they now knew. Fumiko fell into this middle category. She wrote in her journal, "I was raised to believe that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. I taught this to my students. I believed it completely. But now I know that across the ocean, American mothers are teaching their children that living for themselves and their families is what matters. Both cannot be true. One of us must have been deceived. I think I know which one." The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to its sudden, cataclysmic conclusion. For the Japanese POWs on Okinawa, the news arrived through official announcements and whispered rumors that spread through the camps like wildfire. The emperor would speak on the radio, an unprecedented event. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The reaction among the POWs was complex and varied. Some women collapsed in grief, wailing for the dead, for Japan's defeat, for the apparent extinction of